Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is December 1st, 2017. I've put together what I think are some interesting materials to go over today. We're going to start off talking about intelligence and crime, or IQ and crime, or the G factor in crime, call it what you will. First, I'm going to start by reading a piece here, which I think is really interesting. The title is Intelligence and Crime. This is from criminaljustice.iresearch.net.com. In a section titled IQ Differences Between Criminal and Non-Criminal Groups. The majority of studies have found IQ differences between offenders and non-offenders. On average, the IQ for chronic juvenile offenders is 92, about half a standard deviation below the population mean. For chronic adult offenders, however, the average IQ is 85, which is one standard deviation below the population mean. A study of Texas inmates who entered the prison system in 2002 indicated that approximately 23% of the inmates scored below 80. Almost 69% scored between 80 and 109, and only 9.6% scored above 110. To give readers an understanding of the relative proportions of individuals with IQs in those ranges, we offer the following statistics from Ellis and Walsh, 2003. Only 9.18% of individuals in the general population score at or below 80. 63.39% have an IQ between 80 and 109, and 25% have an IQ at or above 110. These data clearly show that low IQ offenders below 80 are substantially overrepresented in the Texas prison population, that those with scores between 80 and 109 are modestly overrepresented compared with a non-incarcerated population, and that individuals with IQ scores at or above 110 are underrepresented in the Texas prison population. Data from every other state reveal the same pattern. IQ scores derived from prison inmates depict a clear relationship between IQ and offending. However, it is important to note that some scholars question the validity of this association. They question whether criminal justice processes function so that intellectually dull offenders are more likely to be incarcerated. If so, the association between IQ and imprisonment would be substantially inflated. Data from non-incarcerated offenders, usually matched on criminal record, cast doubt on these criticisms. Studies have found that low IQ offenders are more likely to be involved in crime over their entire life course, that they are more likely to be involved in chronic property crime, and that they are more likely to commit acts of violence. Their over-involvement in crime, especially crimes involving violence, account for the reasons why they are incarcerated, not their low IQ. Even so, it is important to point out that when data are collected through self-report questionnaires, whereby respondents are asked questions about their involvement in a range of criminal and delinquent acts, the magnitude of the association between IQ and criminal or delinquent involvement diminishes. Whereas some scholars point to this empirical regularity as evidence of the limited explanatory power of IQ, others correctly observe that the types of behaviors being measured influence the IQ. Delinquency association. For example, it is relatively common for adolescents to cheat on tests or to stay out later than their parent-imposed curfews. The majority of adolescents self-report involvement in these types of relatively innocuous behaviors. Because these behaviors are very common, some would argue they're even normal, adolescents from all IQ ranges are equally likely to cheat or to violate their curfews. This should not be taken as evidence that IQ is unimportant in delinquency or criminal behavior. When researchers examine self-report data that are based on measures of relatively serious crimes such as armed robbery, burglary, or assault, they note substantial IQ differences. Individuals with relatively lower IQ are more likely to report engaging in these serious criminal acts. The association between IQ and misbehavior therefore depends on the seriousness of the behavior being analyzed, with the association becoming stronger as the behavior becomes more serious. The strength of the IQ crime association also depends on how frequently the individual engages in criminal and delinquent behavior. Low IQ individuals are more likely to engage in serious misbehavior more frequently than their higher IQ counterparts, and they are more likely to engage in serious misbehavior over a longer span of their life course. Most life course persistent offenders also score relatively low on tests of IQ. Another important aspect of the IQ crime association has to do with the difference between performance IQ and verbal IQ. Verbal IQ reflects an individual's ability to read and comprehend written material and to use words correctly. Performance IQ is assessed through measures of spatial visualization, pattern recognition, and object assembly. Research has consistently shown that offenders are more likely to score lower on measures of verbal IQ than on measures of performance IQ. Explanations for this pattern are in short supply, but the association likely has to do with deficits in the language centers of the brain, specifically Wernicke's and Broca's areas, that are indirectly assessed by the IQ test. Language skills and abilities are crucial for healthy human development and appear universal to humans. For this reason, many linguists view language ability as innate, with the neuronal structures necessary for the development, use, and comprehension of language embedded in our DNA. Indeed, so strong is the language instinct that, barring any biological or genetic insult, all humans will develop the use of a language. The use of language allows individuals to discuss problems and negotiate conflict. It allows for the use of instructions in learning and allows for feedback, teaching, and training. Reading comprehension, moreover, gives one the ability to learn from outside sources and to understand complexity in day-to-day encounters. Language abilities emerge early in the life course, with verbal deficits identifiable by age 3. Unfortunately, language abilities become resistant to change by about age 9 or 10, when the language centers of the brain appear to formalize. The word should probably be crystallized there, but okay. These abilities are highly heritable, so whereas approximately 80 to 85% of the words an individual has in his or her vocabulary overlap with his or her parents' vocabulary, the architecture that allows for these abilities appears to be genetic. Verbal IQ also correlates moderately with the ability to think abstractly. Individuals capable of abstract thinking tend to be able to see the nuances in situations and relationships. They better understand not only the simple but also the complex. They see the interconnections between their attitudes and behaviors and the consequences that flow from their beliefs and behaviors. More important, they can understand how their behaviors and attitudes affect and influence others. Criminals, research tells us, tend to be concrete in their thinking. That is, they view the world in simplistic terms, often much like that of a young child. They are strongly influenced by the here and now. They do not tend to make effective generalizations from one situation to the next, and they tend to be very literal in their understanding of life events. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to move from that to this article from the University of Texas at Dallas. Study shows intelligence levels of prison inmates influences violent misconduct. This is from May 1st, 2012. Subtitled, Doctoral Students Research Links IQ with Propensity Towards Violence in Incarceration. A prison inmate's IQ, as well as the average IQ of a prison unit, can play a role in predicting violent prison conduct, according to a recently published UT Dallas study. The study, featured in the latest issue of the academic journal Intelligence, is a rare examination of the relationship between intelligence and violent misconduct in prison. Previous research has shown the link between IQ and crime in society. UT Dallas doctoral student Bree Diamond led the study, which is co-authored by UT Dallas criminologist Dr. Robert Morris and Dr. J.C. Barnes, who teach in the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences. Using a multi-level modeling approach, the researchers analyzed 3 years of incarceration from a random sample of 2,500 male inmates across 30 prison units who entered the prison between August 2004 and June 2006. The researchers looked at whether an inmate was reported for violent behavior against another inmate or against a prison staff member, resulting in at least a minor injury. Findings showed that inmates with above average IQs were at a reduced risk of being involved in a violent incident, and individuals assigned to units with a higher average IQ score were significantly less likely to commit violent behavior. Diamond, who is earning a PhD in criminology, said an individual's IQ captures the ability to navigate a social environment in addition to assessing academic capabilities. It's not too surprising, then, that people who are deficient in these regards would be more prone to respond physically and lack an advanced repertoire for handling situations, she said. Diamond said the findings could help prison officials better understand how the average IQ of a prison unit has an effect on prison violence. It is a factor that officials could take into account when classifying inmates. What's important about these findings from a research perspective is that we've isolated yet another piece of the puzzle as far as what leads to misconduct. So in the future, researchers looking into violence should control for cognitive ability. Morris said the findings regarding the collective IQ of a prison unit was perhaps the most interesting part of the study. We definitely don't understand the entire package as far as how IQ explains the process leading to an inmate engaging in misbehavior. It's more about IQ playing a role, and that it's not only about a particular person's IQ, but it's about collective IQ in an environment of confinement. Morris said it's a tremendous accomplishment for a graduate student such as Diamond to get her work published in a prestigious journal. It is rare. It's pretty exciting for a criminologist to get a publication in Intelligence. It's a really big deal. Diamond said she was shocked and excited when she learned that Intelligence had accepted her paper. It ends here. Diamond earned her bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in criminal justice from UT Dallas, as well as her master's degree in criminology. She plans to work as a professor following the completion of her doctoral degree in May 2013. And I would suggest she be careful about how she covers the concept of IQ, or she could be in big trouble. So the next thing we'll move to is another piece here. The title is Intelligence in Crime, Measuring the Size of the IQ Crime Correlation. The central question of IQ crime studies is whether individuals with less intelligence on average commit more crime than those with more intelligence, that is, are rare. So whether or not IQ and crime are negatively correlated. The best answer drawn from previous research is a qualified yes. Delinquents and criminals average IQ scores 8 to 10 points lower than non-criminals, which is about 1/2 a standard deviation. IQ and criminal behavior are negatively correlated at about R negative 0.20. You don't need to know that. Here are 5 well-known studies that illustrate the correlation between IQ and crime. Terry Moffat and colleagues studied 4,552 Danish-born men at the end of World War II. They examined intelligence test scores collected by the Danish Army for screening potential draftees and criminal records drawn from the Danish National Police Register. The men who committed 2 or more criminal offenses by age 20 had IQ scores on average a full standard deviation below non-offenders, and IQ and criminal offenses were significantly and negatively correlated. Donald Lenham and colleagues studied 430 7th grade boys in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They measured both IQ and self-reported participation in delinquent acts. Those boys who committed serious delinquent acts such as stealing cars, breaking and entering, or selling drugs scored 8 to 10 IQ points lower than boys who had not. IQ scores and delinquency were correlated, with a correlation between verbal IQ and delinquency being much stronger than the correlation between performance IQ. Håkan Staten and Ingrid Klackenberg Larsson followed 122 Swedish males from ages 3 through 30. They measured IQ at ages 3, 5, 8, 11, 14, and 17 and counted the number of registered criminal offenses through age 30. Frequent offenders, those men with 4 or more criminal offenses, average IQ scores of only 91 points. Sporadic offenders averaged 97 IQ points, and non-offenders averaged a full 102. Remarkably, IQ at age 3 significantly correlated with registered crime at later ages, and also correlated with crime at around, this is another category of a statistical relationship, but there are connections to be sure. Scott Menard and Barbara Morse studied 257 high school students in San Diego, California, measuring both IQ and self-reported delinquency. IQ was correlated with non-serious crimes such as petty theft, liquor violations, vandalism, truancy, and running away. IQ was correlated with serious crimes such as gang fights, auto theft, grand theft, and robbery. Deborah Deno analyzed data from 987 African American school children in Philadelphia. Her data contained multiple measures of intelligence collected at ages 4, 7, and 13, as well as officially recorded criminal offenses. Chronic violent offenders consistently had low IQ scores. For example, female chronic offenders were almost 4 times less likely to be in the top third of verbal IQ test scores than female non-offenders. Similarly, male violent offenders scored 10 to 17 percentile points lower on measures of vocabulary, reading, and language than non-offenders. In addition to finding a robust IQ crime correlation, studies have turned up two other empirical regularities worth noting. The first regards two different types of IQ measures, performance IQ, PIQ, versus verbal IQ, VIQ. Performance IQ is measured with nonverbal tests of attention to detail, manual design construction, and visual puzzle solving. Verbal IQ is measured with tests of general factual knowledge, abstract reasoning, mental arithmetic, and vocabulary. Studies have consistently found that criminals have PIQ scores close to the general population, but VIQ scores substantially lower. This PIQ-VIQ finding holds even when controlling for race, class, and reading ability, suggesting that verbal intelligence is a more important correlate of criminal behavior than other types of intelligence. The second regularity regards official versus self-reported measures of crime. While IQ consistently correlates with both of these measures, the correlation between IQ and official measures tends to be somewhat stronger than the correlation with self-reported crime. And the source of this article, Intelligence and Crime Measuring the Size of IQ Crime Correlation Scores Correlated Criminal and Other Measures, is from law.jrank.org, if you're interested in that. So I'll move from that to another interesting thing on IQ. So this is an article that breaks down IQ by religion. It says here in the introductory portion, in their book IQ and the Wealth of Nations, 2002, Richard Lynn and Tatu Van Hanen, and in the accompanying online article, Intelligence and the Wealth and Poverty of Nations, the authors provided information on national IQs for 185 countries. You can also see Helmuth Nyborg, A Conversation with Richard Lynn, Personality and Individual Differences, 2011. And it generally relates a hypothesis about a very controversial subject area, shall we say. It says here, the hypothesis which fits the facts and makes a great deal of sense is that differences in IQ from the lowest in sub-Saharan Africa up to the highest of the Northeast Asians are explained as deriving from when early humans migrated out of Africa. As the climate became colder, going on to increasingly severe winters, for those who migrated to the north and east, the environment became more cognitively demanding, and so humans had to evolve higher IQs to survive. Now, I have to tell you that this portion is actually more controversial than this makes it sound. When I took courses in anthropology, there were several different theories presented on which environments actually were the more difficult to survive in. I'm not going to go into all the details about that, but we'll just say this one is tied to the climate theory, because there actually are multiple other theories, and you can look into those on your own. Anyway, it says here, Lynn and Van Hanen found that about half the variance that we observe in GDP per capita is accounted for by national IQ, and the other half is explained by the degree to which a nation has natural resources and a free market economy. Now, I would say a relatively free market economy, because there's no such thing as a totally free one. There have also been general improvements in intelligence during the 20th century, and Lynn believes that improvements in nutrition are the primary cause. Perhaps they're referring to the Flynn effect there, I'm not sure. Anyway, you move down to the category for results and conclusion. It says here, Table 2 shows the average Muslim IQ is 81, and the data for other religions are displayed in tables 3 through 8, and the total results are summarized in table 9. So we go down to table 9, and here's what we find. Muslim IQ average 81, Christian IQ average 90, Buddhist IQ average 89, Hindu 80, Animist 69, Jew 94, and atheist with a rather off-the-charts 107 average. So you can make of that what you will. But I do think that it's interesting, that we can see this connection between low IQ and criminality, especially violent crimes. There's another chart that you can look up. It's called World Ranking of Countries by Their Average IQ. At IQ Research, the benchmark of IQ tests. World Ranking of Countries by Their Averages. Which country has the highest IQ? What is the average IQ of your country? Here's the average IQ of more than 80 countries. These numbers came from a work carried out from 2002 to 2006 by Richard Lynn, a British professor of psychology, and Tatu Van Hanen, a Finnish professor of political science who conducted IQ studies in more than 80 countries. And the sources were IQ and the Wealth of Nations, 2006, IQ and Global Inequality, 2002, and another source, Studies of National Cognitive Ability. Anyway, number one on the list here is Hong Kong at 108. Absolutely incredible. Singapore also 108. South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Italy, all these places score very highly. So I want to move down by groupings. We'll go down to the range of, say, 90. Here you find as a sampling Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Chile, Croatia, Turkey, and so on. We move down to, let's say, 85. Eritrea, Fiji, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago. Go down another section to 80. Average IQ of 80. Barbados, El Salvador, Kenya. Move down another 5 points or so. We have Mali, Namibia, Ghana. Down another 5 points or so. And you have Benin, Botswana, Rwanda, Togo, Burundi, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, and Malawi. So, and really, I look at all of this as sort of a curiosity, and it's also to sort of show to the people out there who just, scream pseudoscience every time they hear the concept of IQ, because they absolutely don't understand it. They don't understand psychology, and they don't understand psychometrics. There are all kinds of these correlations that you can find. For example, you can find correlations that exist between mental health issues and smoking. I mean, basically from, my personal experience, every person I've ever known who's had psychological disorders also smokes. Now, that doesn't mean that every person who smokes has psychological disorders, but there are studies that support the case. You have the American Psychiatric Association. I have an article here from June 23, 2016, Smoking and Mental Health, 5 Things Every Psychiatrist Should Know. And it says here, number 1, cigarette smoking is more common among adults with mental health conditions than in the general population. Well, pretty much anybody could figure that out just from their own personal observations, but sometimes they have to have scientific studies to support what we already know by common sense. Here's another one. Number 2, smokers with mental health conditions get sick, become disabled, and die early from smoking-related diseases. 3, many smokers with mental health conditions want to quit and are able to quit smoking. 4, quitting smoking will not interfere with mental health recovery and may have mental health benefits. Now, a lot of people think that it is a coping mechanism for them to be able to smoke or use drugs or alcohol, things like that. It is something they tend to turn to. Number 5, providing smoking cessation assistance is an important part of mental health treatment. So it would be good to get anybody to stop smoking, but especially the mentally ill. And there's another one from the CDC, also tobacco use among adults with mental illness and substance use disorders. There are connections between those things. Use of cigarettes, cigars, smokeless tobacco, pipe tobacco, of course, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, hallucinogens, inhalants, non-medical use of prescription drugs, binge drinking, heavy drinking, so on and so forth. But, it's just the same with these categories as it is drawing up these associations between IQ and criminality, or IQ and life success measures and all of this, and people who try to dismiss that do so contrary to what the actual science has found. And I think that, at a deeper level, when you're talking about IQ, people get really upset and offended about the whole concept. They start taking it as some kind of a moral measure of their personhood. They take it as some sort of a measurement of their soul or their measurement of who they are as a person. And it's really strange that people would have that kind of concept, really, because nobody feels that around like they're 40 times. Like you run a 40 meters or a 40-yard dash or something like that, and then they time you with a stopwatch or something like that, and nobody looks at that and then says, well, I'm a good or bad person. depending on what those particular numbers are. Well, you're not a good or bad person either, based upon whatever your IQ is. Of course, there are high IQ people who are extraordinarily evil, able to accomplish far more evil than low IQ evil people, okay? And on the counter of that, there are, lots and lots and lots of incredibly good and great and wonderful people who have low IQ scores. Who cares? That really should be your approach to it. This is not a measurement of you as a person. It is not a measurement of you as a human being. Okay, it is not a value of you as a person. Okay, every person is important. Every person is sacred deeply, all the way to their soul. Even if you don't believe in a soul, there is a sacredness to human life, and IQ is not something that captures that aspect. And people get so offended about it, I think, because they confuse those completely separate categories. That's just my opinion on it. Maybe I'm wrong. But in the future, I'm definitely going to circle back to this topic repeatedly, mostly to, sort of dispel these misunderstandings of IQ and what it means, but also just because I have a particular personal interest in it. So that's all for today. Thank you.